Night falls on Caracas. At Miraflores' presidential palace, chandeliers blaze. Guards stand at attention beneath colonial archways. Generators ensure the power never fails. A few kilometers away, lines form at gas stations. Families wait hours for fuel in a nation built on oil. Children go to bed hungry in a country that was once Latin America's wealthiest. The contrast is stark. The palace functions. The nation falters. Behind this lies a story of gold. Venezuela accumulated 372 metric tons by 2011. Standard bars, international hallmarks. Each one tracked, numbered, meant to anchor the currency and provide emergency reserves. Then came collapse. Oil prices fell. The economy followed, and the gold began to move. By 2023, roughly 50 tons remained. 322 tons had vanished, loaded onto jets, flown to Turkey, the UAE, and beyond, converted into regime survival. The question is simple. Where did Venezuela's gold go? And who actually paid for the palace that still stands? In 1914, the same year an American fortune built Biltmore in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Venezuela discovered something else. Oil. Not in small quantities. Oceans of it, trapped beneath Lake Maracaibo and the eastern plains. That year, Shell Oil struck at the Mene Grande field. The well came in strong. Within months, foreign companies raced to lease concessions. Within a decade, Venezuela had transformed from a minor agricultural exporter into a petrostate. The money arrived quickly. By the 1922nd, oil revenue exceeded all other exports combined. Roads were paved, ports expanded. Caracas, the capital, began to modernize. Electric lines went up, buildings climbed higher. The economy, once dependent on coffee and cacao, now ran on crude. Production climbed year after year. By 1928, Venezuela was the world's largest oil exporter, surpassing even the United States in international sales. The wealth was real. In the 1952nd, General Marcos Pérez Jiménez used oil revenue to fund massive infrastructure projects. Highways cut through mountains. The Caracas metro system was planned. Public housing rose in neat rows. Venezuelans enjoyed one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. By the 1972nd, per capita income in Venezuela approached that of some European nations. The country was rich, not on paper, in tangible ways. Middle-class families owned cars. Universities expanded. Healthcare reached rural areas. At the center of this prosperity stood a building that carried symbolic weight beyond its architecture, Miraflores Palace. The structure dated to 1884, built originally as a private residence in the neoclassical style favored by Caracas elites. Yellow walls, white columns, gardens laid out in geometric precision. In the early 20th century, as oil revenue swelled, the government acquired the property. By the 1922nd, Miraflores had become the official seat of the presidency. The palace was not vast by European standards. 40 rooms across several connected buildings, reception halls for state functions, private quarters for the president and family, office space for ministers and advisors, gardens and courtyards that softened the tropical heat. What mattered was not size but meaning. Miraflores represented the state. Whoever controlled the palace controlled Venezuela, and control required resources. Oil provided those resources in abundance. Governments came and went, some democratic, some military, but the pattern held. Oil revenue funded the state apparatus, salaries for soldiers and bureaucrats, subsidies for gasoline and food, construction projects that employed thousands. The palace itself required upkeep, security, staff, all paid from the national treasury, all ultimately backed by crude flowing from Maracaibo and Zulia and Anzoátegui. The bargain seemed sustainable. Venezuela held proven reserves, estimated in the tens of billions of barrels. New fields were discovered regularly. production technology improved. Prices fluctuated, but over decades, the trend was upward. By the 1970s, after the OPEC oil shocks, Venezuela earned unprecedented revenue. The government of Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized the industry in 1976, creating Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA. The state now controlled extraction, refining, and export. The money flowed directly into government coffers. And yet, beneath the prosperity, a structural weakness took root. Venezuela produced almost nothing else of value. Manufacturing remained limited. Agriculture, once the backbone, had withered as workers moved to oil fields and cities. Food was imported, machinery was imported, even basic consumer goods arrived from abroad, paid for with oil dollars. The economy had one engine: crude. This was not unique. Many oil-rich nations followed similar paths, but Venezuela's dependence was extreme. In the 1970s, oil accounted for more than 90% of export earnings. When prices were high, the country prospered. When prices softened, budgets strained. No one seriously planned for a future without oil. The reserves seemed infinite. The global economy needed energy. Demand would always exist. Political leaders governed accordingly: spend in good times, borrow in lean times. The palace reflected this confidence. Renovations came in cycles, new wings added, technology upgraded, security expanded. Miraflores was not a museum. It was a working command center, and it required constant investment to function. By the 1990s, Venezuela had been an oil state for 3 generations. Entire careers, industries, and cities had been built on the assumption that crude would always pay the bills. The palace had seen presidents come and go, civilian and military, reformers and strongmen, but the foundation remained. Oil money sustained the state. The state maintained the palace, and the palace symbolized continuity, prosperity, and power. Then came 1998, an election. A former military officer named Hugo Chavez, who had attempted a coup 6 years earlier, ran for president on a populist platform. He promised to redistribute oil wealth directly to the poor. He won decisively. In February 1999, Chavez walked through the gates of Miraflores Palace and took office. He would transform not just policy, but the palace itself, and he would govern during the greatest oil boom in Venezuela's history. The boom that made everything seem possible, and the boom that, when it ended, would leave the vaults empty and the nation broken. Oil made Venezuela rich, but wealth without diversification is fragile. And in Caracas, one man would soon harness that wealth not just to govern, but to build a revolutionary machine. His name was Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez Frias was not born into Venezuela's elite. He came from a working-class family in the plains of Barinas. His father was a schoolteacher. Chavez joined the military academy, studied history, and rose through the ranks. But he was never fully at ease with the institution. He read widely, favored Simón Bolívar, and developed a populist political philosophy that mixed nationalism, socialism, and anti-imperialism. In February 1992, Chavez led a military coup attempt against President Carlos Andrés Pérez. The coup failed. Chavez was arrested and imprisoned. But before he was taken away, he appeared briefly on national television to call for his co-conspirators to lay down arms. He said the movement had failed. For now, those 2 words resonated. Chavez became a symbol of resistance to a political establishment widely seen as corrupt and disconnected from ordinary Venezuelans. Released from prison in 1994, Chavez shifted strategy. He would seek power through elections. He formed a political movement, campaigned relentlessly, and promised a Bolivarian revolution that would redistribute oil wealth to the poor. In December 1998, he won the presidency with 56% of the vote. On the 2nd of February 1999, he walked through the gates of Miraflores Palace and took office. The palace changed immediately. Chavez did not use it the way previous presidents had. he turned it into theater. Within months, he launched a weekly television program broadcast live from Miraflores and other locations. Allo Presidente. Hello, President. The show ran for hours, sometimes 6 or more. Chavez spoke directly to the camera, took calls from citizens, announced policy, sang songs, recited poetry, and denounced opponents. It was unprecedented. A head of state using the presidential palace as a broadcasting studio, addressing millions without filters or intermediaries. Miraflores became the nerve center of a new political system. Chavez staffed it with loyalists, many from the military or his movement. Security forces expanded. The palace was not just protected but fortified. The presidential guard grew in size and equipment. Intelligence services operated from offices nearby. Physical control of Miraflores meant control of the state, and Chavez never forgot the lesson of 1992. He ensured that the palace would remain in friendly hands. Beneath the spectacle, Chavez built economic machinery designed to sustain his political coalition. In 2003, after a brief period of economic instability and a failed opposition coup, he imposed strict currency controls. The system was called CADIVI, the Commission for the Administration of Foreign Currency. The government now controlled access to dollars. Businesses needed approval to import goods. Individuals needed permission to travel abroad with foreign currency. The official exchange rate was set artificially low. Those with access to dollars at the official rate could profit enormously by selling them on the black market. Access became a form of patronage. Chavez also moved to consolidate control over Venezuela's oil industry. PDVSA, the state oil company, had historically operated with significant autonomy. Its executives were technocrats, often trained abroad, focused on efficiency and production. Chavez distrusted them. In 2002 and 2003, after PDVSA managers joined an opposition strike, he fired thousands of employees and replaced them with political loyalists. PDVSA became an instrument of state policy, not just a revenue generator. The company funded social programs directly, bypassing traditional budget processes. Misiones, missions, programs providing healthcare, education, and food subsidies, operated with oil money channeled through PDVSA. The system worked as long as oil prices stayed high, and they did. In 2004, crude averaged around $38 per barrel. By 2008, it touched $140. The Venezuelan government earned unprecedented revenue. PDVSA production hovered around 2.5 to 3 million barrels per day. At $100 per barrel, that meant billions flowing into state coffers monthly. Chavez spent freely. Social programs expanded. Public employment grew. Subsidies kept gasoline cheaper than bottled water. Housing projects multiplied. The government purchased everything from military equipment to food imports. Allies in the region received subsidized oil. Cuba, Nicaragua, and others benefited from Venezuelan generosity. The spending created political loyalty. Millions of Venezuelans saw tangible improvements in their lives. Poverty rates fell through the 2000s. Access to healthcare and education improved. But the foundation was unchanged. Venezuela still produced little besides oil. Manufacturing continued its long decline. Agriculture withered further. Imports, now controlled through CADIVI, became the primary source of consumer goods. The system was fragile. High oil prices masked inefficiencies, corruption, and the absence of productive economic activity outside the petroleum sector. During this period, Venezuela also built its gold reserves. Central banks hold gold for several reasons. It anchors confidence in the currency. It provides liquidity in emergencies. It signals stability to international markets. By the mid-2000s, Venezuela's reserves climbed. The Central Bank of Venezuela purchased gold steadily. By 2011, official holdings reached approximately 372 metric tons. At the time, gold traded around $1,500 per troy ounce. The total value approached $18 billion. The gold sat in vaults, most at the central bank in Caracas. Some held abroad at institutions like the Bank of England. Each bar was standard size, 400 troy ounces, stamped with hallmarks and serial numbers that identified weight, purity, and origin. These were not decorative objects. They were monetary instruments, tracked internationally, part of the country's sovereign wealth. By law, the reserves could not be sold or moved without legislative approval. They represented insurance. If oil revenue faltered, the gold would provide a cushion. At Miraflores, daily operations reflected the oil boom. Staff numbers were substantial. Security forces, household employees, political advisors, media teams for Allo Presidente, drivers, cooks, technicians. Exact figures are difficult to verify, but by most accounts, hundreds of people worked directly or indirectly for the palace. Salaries came from the national budget, which came from oil. The palace itself was renovated and modernized. Technology was upgraded, communications, equipment installed for broadcasts, security systems enhanced. The gardens were maintained, vehicles were replaced. The building functioned smoothly because the state had money, and the state had money because crude traded above $100 per barrel. Chávez governed from Miraflores for 14 years. He won re-election multiple times, though opposition groups and international observers raised concerns about media access, electoral fairness, and political intimidation. Regardless of these controversies, Chávez retained significant popular support, particularly among the poor and working class who benefited from social programs. The palace became inseparable from his persona. It was where he broadcast, where he met foreign leaders, where he made announcements and declared policy. Miraflores was not just a building. It was the stage for Bolivarian socialism, the symbol of a movement, the command center for redistributing oil wealth. And the arithmetic was simple. As long as oil stayed above $80 or $90 per barrel, the system functioned. Social programs could be funded, subsidies maintained, imports purchased, salaries paid. The palace could operate. The gold could remain untouched. But arithmetic has no loyalty. It does not care about ideology or popularity. It responds only to inputs and outputs, revenue and expense, production and price. Chávez died in March 2013. Cancer. The palace passed to his chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, and with it, the machine that required $100 oil to function. Oil was already falling. Nicolás Maduro takes office. The palace still functions. Lights burn in the reception halls. Security patrols the grounds. Staff move through corridors on familiar routines. From the outside, Miraflores appears unchanged. The transition from Chávez to Maduro was constitutional, orderly. The machinery continues. But Maduro is not Chávez. He lacks the charisma, the oratorical gift, the instinctive connection to crowds. He is a former bus driver and union organizer who rose through loyalty, not brilliance. Chávez chose him precisely because he was dependable and unlikely to challenge the revolutionary project. Maduro's task is not to innovate, but to preserve, to keep the system running as Chávez had built it. The palace in these early years requires substantial staffing. Security forces form the largest component. The Presidential Guard numbers in the thousands, a heavily armed force responsible for protecting not just the palace, but the president personally. Soldiers patrol the perimeter. Armored vehicles park in designated areas. Access points are controlled by layers of checkpoints. Beyond physical security, intelligence services operate from nearby facilities, monitoring threats, domestic and foreign. Household staff keep the building operational. Cleaners maintain the marble floors and polished wood. Cooks prepare meals for the president, his advisors, and visiting officials. Drivers manage a fleet of vehicles. Technicians handle communications equipment, much of it installed during the Allo Presidente era. Political advisors, speechwriters, and media coordinators work from offices within the complex. The exact number of employees is difficult to confirm from public records, but by most accounts, several hundred people draw salaries linked directly or indirectly to palace operations. All of this costs money. Security alone consumes a substantial portion of the palace budget. Soldiers receive wages. Equipment requires maintenance. Vehicles need fuel. Household expenses, while smaller, are continuous. Food, supplies, utilities, repairs. The palace also funds political activities, campaign costs, propaganda production, payments to loyalists. The total is difficult to isolate from broader government spending, but it is not trivial. In 2013, oil revenue still covers these costs comfortably. Crude averages around $100 per barrel. PDVSA production, though declining slightly from its peak, still generates billions in monthly income. The palace operates without visible strain. But beneath this apparent stability, Venezuela holds something else: insurance, a buffer against disaster. Gold. Deep within the central bank of Venezuela, in secure vaults designed to withstand earthquakes and attacks, sit 372 metric tons of gold. Not coins or jewelry, monetary gold. Standard bars, each weighing 400 troy ounces, approximately 12.4 kilograms. The bars are cast to international specifications, purity of 99.5% or higher. Each bar carries hallmarks stamped into the metal: a serial number, the refiner's mark, weight, and fineness. These are not abstract assets. They are physical objects, stacked in precise rows on reinforced shelving, climate-controlled to prevent corrosion, guarded around the clock. The central bank maintains detailed inventories. Every bar is logged, serial numbers cross-referenced. Periodic audits verify that what the records claim matches what actually sits in the vaults. Some of Venezuela's gold is held abroad, chiefly at the Bank of England in London, a common arrangement for central banks seeking secure storage and easier access to international markets. But the majority, roughly 280 tons by some estimates, remains in Caracas. The purpose of these reserves is well understood in monetary policy. Gold anchors confidence. It signals to international markets that the country can meet obligations even in crisis. It provides liquidity. If foreign currency reserves run low, gold can be sold or used as collateral for loans. It is a store of value that does not depend on any government's fiscal discipline or any central bank's printing press. For Venezuela, with its extreme dependence on oil, the gold represents a final line of defense. If oil prices collapse, if revenue falls, if the economy enters crisis, the gold can be mobilized. Not easily, and not without cost, but it is there, a cushion, an emergency fund built over decades. Venezuelan law protects these reserves. The central bank operates under statutes that require legislative approval for major asset sales. The gold cannot simply be moved or sold by executive decree. The legal framework is designed to prevent precisely that kind of impulsive action. The reserves belong to the nation, not to any individual administration. In 2013, gold trades around $1,400 per troy ounce. 372 metric tons equals roughly 12 million troy ounces. The total value approaches $17 billion. That is substantial. It could purchase a year's worth of critical imports, or fund emergency social programs, or service foreign debt, or buy time while deeper economic reforms take hold. The gold sits, untouched, according to law and according to plan. At Miraflores, this is understood. Maduro's economic team knows the reserves exist. They know the value. They also know, or believe they know, that the gold will not be needed. Oil will recover if it dips. PDVSA will maintain production. The revolutionary project will endure. The gold is insurance against a catastrophe that seems unlikely. But warning signs are already visible to anyone watching closely. Oil prices in 2013, while still around $100, are softer than their 2008 peak of $140. PDVSA production is declining. Mismanagement, underinvestment, and the replacement of technical staff with political loyalists have eroded efficiency. Fields that once produced reliably now yield less. New exploration has stalled. Inflation is climbing. In 2013, it reaches 40% annually. The currency controls imposed under Chavez create distortions. Businesses struggle to access dollars for imports. Black market exchange rates diverge sharply from the official rate. Shortages appear. First luxury goods, then staples, toilet paper, milk, flour. The import dependency built over decades becomes a vulnerability. Venezuela produces almost nothing domestically except oil. When Khedive restricts dollar access, goods simply do not arrive. Factories idle for lack of raw materials. Shelves empty. Agricultural production continues its long collapse. Land expropriated under Chavez lies underutilized. Farmers who once exported now cannot meet domestic demand. Food must be imported, but importing requires dollars, and dollars are rationed by a bureaucracy prone to corruption and inefficiency. The palace, insulated by state resources, does not yet feel these pressures acutely. Supplies reach Miraflores. Generators ensure power. Security forces remain paid and loyal. But the broader economy is showing strain. Maduro's government responds not with structural reform, but with denial and improvisation. Price controls are imposed to fight inflation. They create further shortages as producers cannot cover costs. The currency is devalued periodically, but never enough to reflect reality. The black market thrives. And oil continues to soften. In 2014, it averages around $96 per barrel. Still high by historical standards. Still sufficient to fund government operations. But the trend is downward. Geopolitical factors, increased production from shale fields in North America, and slowing global demand, all pressure prices. The palace operates as though none of this is structural, as though the problems are temporary, solvable through willpower and revolutionary rhetoric. The gold remains in the vaults, a reassuring presence on balance sheets, untouched by the turbulence above. The belief is simple. Venezuela has weathered oil price swings before. The reserves are there if truly needed, but they will not be needed. The revolution will endure. The system will hold. This belief would prove costly. The gold sat in vaults designed to last for generations, guarded, accounted for, untouchable by law. But laws can change when oil collapses. June 2014, oil touches $115 per barrel. Global markets seem stable. PDVSA still pumps roughly 2.5 million barrels daily. Venezuela's government budget, built on the assumption of $90 oil, appears sustainable. At Miraflores, operations continue without disruption. Then the floor drops. By September 2014, crude falls below $90. By December, it trades around $60. The decline accelerates. January 2015, $48. August 2015, $42. January 2016, $26 per barrel. In 18 months, oil loses more than 3/4 of its value. For an economy that depends on petroleum for over 90% of export revenue, this is not a recession. It is collapse. The arithmetic is immediate and brutal. Venezuela's government had budgeted for oil at $80 to $100. At $26, revenue falls by roughly 70%. Billions of dollars that were supposed to flow into the treasury simply vanish. Social programs cannot be funded. Salaries cannot be paid in full. Imports cannot be purchased. The machinery built by Chavez, sustained by a decade of high oil prices, loses its fuel. The impact cascades through the economy. Venezuela imports nearly everything: food, medicine, machinery, consumer goods. Access to those imports requires dollars. Dollars come from oil sales. When oil revenue collapses, dollar inflows collapse. Khedive, the currency control system, tightens further. Businesses cannot obtain foreign currency to buy inventory. Shelves empty. Not just luxury items now. Basics: flour, rice, cooking oil, diapers, soap. Inflation, already high, begins an exponential climb. In 2014, it reaches approximately 62%. In 2015, 121%. By 2016, over 250%, and accelerating. The bolivar, pegged artificially by government decree, becomes worthless in practice. The black market exchange rate diverges wildly from the official rate. A dollar that officially costs 10 bolivars trades on the street for 100, then 500, then more. Holding local currency is financial suicide. Anyone with access to dollars hoards them. Hospitals run out of basic supplies, antibiotics, painkillers, surgical gloves. Doctors operate without anesthesia in some facilities. Patients bring their own sheets and food. Infant mortality begins to rise. Diseases that had been controlled for decades, malaria, diphtheria, measles, return. Power outages become routine. The national grid, underinvested for years, cannot handle demand. Rolling blackouts sweep through cities. Some areas lose power for hours daily. Businesses close early. Refrigeration fails. Food spoils. At Miraflores, the palace does not go dark. Generators ensure continuous power. Security forces remain paid, though often in delayed installments. Food reaches the kitchens. Fuel reaches the vehicles. The palace is insulated, not immune, but protected by state priority. Resources that no longer reach hospitals or schools still reach the presidential complex. This disparity is visible and deliberate. The lights burn at Miraflores, while Caracas neighborhoods sit in darkness. The palace functions while the nation fails. The contrast fuels resentment, but resentment without organization is only noise. Security keeps protesters at a distance. The palace holds, but even insulation has limits. Maduro's government faces a fiscal crisis. Monthly expenses far exceed oil revenue. The social programs that built political loyalty cannot be sustained at prior levels. Subsidies are cut. Public sector wages stagnate, then lose value to inflation. The misiones, the missions that delivered healthcare and food, shrink or collapse. The government needs cash, immediately. Not loans that require negotiation and collateral. Not budget cuts that trigger unrest. Cash to keep the core apparatus functioning. To pay the military. To maintain security forces. To prevent the kind of fracture that ends regimes. The gold becomes relevant. In 2014, Venezuela's central bank begins selling gold from its reserves. The transactions are not announced publicly. They appear in quarterly financial statements, often months later, as reductions in official holdings. The justification, when offered, is emergency liquidity, a temporary measure to manage cash flow while oil prices stabilize. The legal situation is ambiguous. Venezuelan law requires legislative approval for major asset sales by the central bank. But the legislature, controlled by government allies until late 2015, does not formally authorize these transactions. The sales proceed anyway. Executive action, crisis management. The institutional guardrails designed to protect national reserves bend under pressure. By some estimates, Venezuela sells between 25 and 40 metric tons of gold in 2014 and 2015. The exact volume is difficult to confirm. Central bank transparency deteriorates. Financial statements become less detailed. Independent verification is impossible. But investigative journalists tracking international gold flows and analyzing official reserve data suggest this range. At $1,200 per troy ounce, 30 tons of gold equals roughly $1.2 billion. Substantial. Enough to cover several months of critical expenses, pay soldiers, import fuel, buy political loyalty in key sectors. The sales provide breathing room, but breathing room is not a solution. The underlying problem persists. Oil revenue remains far below budget requirements. Inflation continues to accelerate. The economy shrinks. By 2016, GDP contracts by an estimated 10%. Businesses fail. Unemployment rises. Millions of Venezuelans begin skipping meals, not by choice, but by necessity. The palace operations strain. Budget allocations tighten. Maintenance is deferred. Non-essential positions go unfilled. Security forces, the most critical component, remain prioritized. But even they face delayed payments and reduced benefits. Loyalty is tested. Maduro's government responds with denial and deflection. The crisis is blamed on external forces, American sanctions, which have not yet been imposed, economic warfare, sabotage by the opposition. The narrative serves a purpose. It shifts responsibility and justifies authoritarian measures. But it does not generate revenue. It does not pay bills. The gold sales continue. Each transaction reduces the reserves. Each reduction weakens the country's financial position. The insurance policy is being spent not on national recovery, but on regime survival. The distinction matters. National recovery would mean infrastructure, investment, economic reform, measures to restore production. Regime survival means paying the people who keep Maduro in power. Military officers, intelligence operatives, inner circle loyalists. The arithmetic is clear. Oil at $26 cannot sustain the Venezuelan state as constructed. Gold sales can delay collapse, but not prevent it. Each ton sold buys a few months. The reserves are finite. 372 tons sounds like abundance, but at the rate of emergency spending, it can vanish quickly. In late 2015, the opposition wins control of the National Assembly in parliamentary elections. This creates a new complication. The legislature, now hostile to Maduro, refuses to authorize further gold sales. The government ignores them. The sales continue. Legal ambiguity becomes legal violation. The distinction, in practice, changes little. Enforcement requires power. Power remains with those who control the palace. By the end of 2016, Venezuela's reserves have fallen to roughly 330 tons, down from 372. Oil prices have recovered slightly, stabilizing around $45 to $50 per barrel. Better than $26, but nowhere near the $100 the system requires. The economic collapse continues. The first sales were described as prudent crisis management, emergency measures, temporary. But the crisis was not temporary, and the sales would not stop. By 2017, something had shifted. From emergency to system, from crisis management to systematic looting, Venezuelans lose an average of 24 pounds. Not by choice, not through diet plans or fitness trends. Starvation. The ENCOVI survey, conducted by Venezuelan universities, documents the collapse in clinical terms. By 2017, 87% of households fall below the poverty line. Nearly 60% report going to bed hungry at least once in the past 3 months. Food is available, technically, but priced beyond reach. A kilogram of rice costs a month's minimum wage. Milk, when found, trades for the equivalent of several days' salary. Infant mortality, which had fallen steadily for decades, reverses course. Hospitals report deaths from malnutrition, preventable infections, complications during childbirth that would be routine to manage with basic supplies. Medicine vanishes from pharmacies. Antibiotics, insulin, chemotherapy drugs. Patients with chronic conditions, diabetes, hypertension, cancer, deteriorate without treatment. Diseases that had been eradicated or controlled return. Malaria cases surge, particularly in mining regions where standing water breeds mosquitoes and healthcare infrastructure has collapsed entirely. Diphtheria, once eliminated by vaccination programs, reappears. Measles spreads. Children die from illnesses that developed nations consider historical footnotes. The electrical grid fails more frequently. Blackouts last hours, sometimes days. Refrigeration stops. Food spoils. Water pumps go offline. Residents of high-rise buildings climb stairs in darkness because elevators are dead. Hospitals rely on generators that often lack fuel. By 2018, An estimated 4 million Venezuelans have fled the country. They walk across borders into Colombia, Brazil, Peru. Families scatter. Parents send children ahead. The exodus is visible in border towns where makeshift camps appear, in buses overloaded with migrants, in the faces of people carrying everything they own in single backpacks. At Miraflores Palace, a different reality persists. Meals are served, not rationed, not improvised from shortages. Security forces receive provisions. The generators ensuring uninterrupted power are fueled without fail. The building functions as though the collapse outside its gates does not exist. This is not ignorance. This is allocation. Resources that no longer reach the population still reach the palace. The military command, the intelligence services. The state has narrowed. It no longer governs for the nation. It maintains control of key institutions. Priorities are clear. Keep the security apparatus loyal. Keep the palace operational. The rest can wait. And the gold continues to move. Between 2017 and 2019, the pace of gold sales accelerates dramatically. By estimates drawn from investigative journalism, primarily reports by Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Venezuelan investigative outlet Armando.info, Venezuela sells between 100 and 150 metric tons during this period. The exact figure remains uncertain. The central bank ceases publishing detailed reserve data. International Monetary Fund statistics show sharp declines in Venezuela's reported holdings, but the government no longer cooperates fully with IMF transparency requirements. What becomes clear through investigation is not just the volume but the mechanism. This is not the formal sale of monetary gold through established international markets. This is extraction, covert, deliberate, designed to avoid oversight. The pattern that emerges involves private aircraft. Gold bars are loaded at Simón Bolívar International Airport outside Caracas. The planes, often chartered jets, fly to Turkey. Some flights go to the United Arab Emirates. The loads are substantial. A single flight can carry several hundred kilograms. The bars are standard monetary gold, 400 troy ounces each, stamped with serial numbers, purity marks, and refiner hallmarks. In Turkey, the primary destination is Sardas Kuyumkuluk, a refinery in Istanbul. Investigative journalists, tracing flight manifests and interviewing sources within the gold trade, identified Sardas as a key processor of Venezuelan gold. The refinery resmelts the bars, a process that removes original hallmarks and produces new bars with different serial numbers. Once resmelted, the gold's origin becomes difficult to trace. It enters the global market as Turkish refined gold, not Venezuelan reserves. In the UAE, Dubai's gold dealers facilitate similar transactions. The bars arrive, are processed, and sold into the retail and wholesale markets that move gold across Asia and beyond. The UAE has long served as a hub for gold trading, with looser regulations than European or American markets. Venezuelan gold flows through this system and disappears into thousands of smaller transactions. The money from these sales does not return to Venezuela's treasury. It does not fund hospitals or food imports or infrastructure repair. According to investigative reporting, it flows into accounts controlled by individuals close to the Maduro regime, offshore banks in jurisdictions with banking secrecy laws, front companies, intermediaries who take cuts for arranging logistics. The gold is converted into cash, and the cash is used to maintain the machinery of power. Military officers receive bonuses, not in worthless bolivars, but in dollars or euros. Security forces get imported goods, food, equipment. The Presidential Guard sees its budget protected. These are the mechanisms that prevent a coup. Gold buys loyalty. Loyalty preserves the regime. Journalists manage to trace specific bars. Serial numbers photographed in Caracas vaults in earlier years appear on manifests for flights to Istanbul. Some bars with Venezuelan central bank hallmarks were documented in Turkish facilities. The forensic trail is incomplete. Access to records is limited, but enough evidence exists to establish the pattern. National reserves were systematically extracted and converted into regime survival funds. The legal reality is unambiguous. Venezuelan law requires legislative authorization for the sale of central bank reserves. The National Assembly, controlled by opposition parties since 2015, never approved these transactions. The sales proceeded anyway. This is not crisis management within legal bounds. This is theft. The reserves belonged to the nation. They were taken by individuals with access to state power and converted into personal or political assets. Maduro faced a choice. The gold could have been used differently. $18 billion worth of gold could have purchased medicine for every hospital, food for emergency distribution, fuel for the electrical grid, imports to stabilize the currency. It could have bought time for economic reform, for negotiations with creditors, for a managed recovery. Or it could buy military loyalty, keep generals paid, ensure security forces remain armed and fed, maintain the apparatus that prevents overthrow. From the perspective of regime survival, the logic is clear. Feeding civilians does not prevent a coup. Paying soldiers does. The humanitarian cost was immense. The political choice was calculated. Maduro chose the palace over the nation. The gold went to Turkey and the UAE. The people went hungry. And by 2020, the vaults that once held 372 metric tons held roughly 50. The rest was gone, scattered across continents, converted into regime survival. The insurance Venezuela accumulated over generations, spent in 3 years to keep one man in power. The gold sales did not save Venezuela, they saved the palace. And by 2020, the vaults that once held 372 tons held roughly 50. The rest was gone, scattered across continents, converted into regime survival. 372 metric tons in 2011, roughly 50 tons in 2023, 322 tons missing. The accounting is simple. The trail is complex. Some of the gold is traceable. Flight manifests, customs records, refinery logs. Investigative journalists working for Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Venezuelan outlet Armando.info spent years piecing together the path. Other portions vanished into systems designed specifically to obscure origin. The global gold market absorbs billions of dollars in transactions daily. Once bars are resmelted and restamped, tracing becomes nearly impossible. What is known with confidence? Turkey received substantial shipments. Sardes Kuyumkuluk, the Istanbul refinery, processed Venezuelan gold throughout 2018 and 2019. The bars arrived by chartered flights from Caracas, were resmelted to remove original hallmarks, and re-entered the market with Turkish refinery stamps. Investigators documented specific flights, interviewed sources within the gold trade, and cross-referenced shipment volumes with declining Venezuelan reserve data. Estimates suggest Turkey processed at least 70 to 90 tons of Venezuelan gold during this period. The United Arab Emirates served as another major destination. Dubai's gold markets, with lighter regulatory oversight than European or American exchanges, facilitated transactions. Bars arrived, moved through dealers, and dispersed into the retail and wholesale networks that supply Asia and beyond. Exact volumes are harder to confirm. The UAE does not publish detailed import data by origin country, and Dubai's gold trade operates with significant privacy protections. But flight records and shipping manifests, reviewed by investigative teams, establish the UAE as a consistent endpoint for Venezuelan gold. Switzerland, historically a hub for gold refining and trading, received smaller amounts before international pressure tightened. Swiss refineries are subject to stricter sourcing regulations and face reputational risk for handling gold from questionable origins. By 2018, most Swiss firms had ceased accepting Venezuelan shipments. Some gold reached Switzerland earlier, in 2016 and 2017, before the nature of the transactions became widely known. Russia and China were also reported destinations, though details are sparse. Some analysts and journalists cited gold for credit arrangements. Venezuela would ship gold as collateral for loans or advance payments. The gold would not return. The loans, if they existed, went to regime priorities, not national infrastructure. Confirmation is difficult. Neither Russia nor China publishes detailed records of such transactions, and Venezuelan government transparency had collapsed entirely by this point. Who profited? Not the Venezuelan people. The money generated by these sales did not flow into the national treasury. According to investigative reporting and leaked financial documents, proceeds moved through offshore accounts controlled by individuals within Maduro's inner circle. Front companies registered in jurisdictions with banking secrecy laws. Intermediaries who arranged logistics, provided aircraft, and facilitated refinery access took their cuts. Some estimates suggest intermediaries captured 10 to 20% of the gold's value in fees and commissions. Military officers loyal to Maduro received bonuses and payments, often in foreign currency. Security forces got access to imported goods that the general population could not obtain: food, electronics, vehicles. These benefits were not formal salaries. They were patronage, loyalty purchased with national wealth, converted into private advantage. What remains in Venezuela? By 2023, the Central Bank of Venezuela reported approximately 50 tons of gold in domestic vaults. The exact location and condition of these reserves is unclear. The central bank has not allowed independent audits in years. The reported figure may be accurate, or it may be optimistic. An additional 31 tons of Venezuelan gold sits in the vaults of the Bank of England in London. This gold has been frozen since 2018, the subject of a legal battle between the Maduro government and Juan Guaidó, the opposition leader who declared himself interim president in 2019. Venezuela traditionally held a portion of its reserves in London for easier access to international markets. When political tensions escalated, the United Kingdom government refused to release the gold to Maduro, citing concerns about legitimacy and governance. The legal case proceeded through British courts. In 2020, a UK High Court ruled that the British government recognized Guaidó, not Maduro, as Venezuela's legitimate leader. Therefore, the gold could not be released to Maduro's representatives. The ruling was appealed. In 2022, an appellate court partially reversed the decision, acknowledging complexities in the recognition question. As of early 2024, the 31 tons remain in London, legally contested and practically inaccessible to either claimant. International sanctions attempted to halt the gold sales, but arrived too late to prevent the bulk of the extraction. The United States imposed targeted sanctions on Venezuelan officials and entities beginning in 2017. By 2019, the U.S. Treasury explicitly prohibited American individuals and companies from transacting in Venezuelan gold. The European Union implemented similar restrictions. These measures closed off Western markets and made transactions more difficult. But they did not stop the sales. They merely shifted the geography. Turkey, the UAE, and other jurisdictions with looser enforcement became the outlets. By the time sanctions were comprehensive, most of the gold had already left. The counterfactual is straightforward and brutal. 322 metric tons of gold, at an average price of approximately $1,500 per troy ounce, equals roughly $15.5 billion. If calculated at the higher prices seen in 2020, around $1,800 per ounce, the total approaches $18.6 billion. That is not an abstract figure. It is purchasing power. $18 billion could have imported medicine for every hospital in Venezuela for years. It could have purchased food for emergency distribution to millions of families. It could have funded fuel for the electrical grid, stabilizing power and preventing the cascading failures that crippled industry and public services. It could have been used to service foreign debt, negotiating with creditors for restructuring, and buying goodwill in international markets. It could have backed a currency stabilization plan, providing reserves to defend the bolivar and halt hyperinflation. Or it could buy military loyalty. Maduro's calculus was clear. Feeding civilians does not prevent a coup. Generals who go unpaid defect. Security forces without resources fracture. The palace survives, not through popular support, but through controlled coercion. Paying the military ensures they remain loyal. Ensuring their loyalty preserves the regime. The gold was spent on regime survival, not national recovery, because from Maduro's perspective, the regime is the only thing that matters. This logic is not irrational within its own frame. It is coldly pragmatic. A leader who loses the support of armed forces loses power. Power, once lost, cannot be recovered by feeding the hungry. Maduro chose to maintain control of the palace and accepted national suffering as the price. The choice was deliberate. The cost was borne by others. The moral dimension is unavoidable. Edith Vanderbilt, facing the collapse of her husband's estate, made hard choices. She sold land to save the house. She cut staff, closed wings, opened the doors to tourists. She adapted to preserve something, accepting that it could not remain as it had been. Her choices prioritized continuity over original vision. She saved what could be saved. Maduro made different choices under different pressures. He did not adapt to preserve the nation. He extracted from the nation to preserve himself. The gold that was supposed to ensure Venezuela against catastrophe was spent to insulate the regime from the catastrophe it had created. The parallel is instructive. Both faced fiscal collapse. Both controlled significant assets. One chose preservation through service. The other chose survival through predation. The international community observed, but could not prevent the extraction. Sanctions imposed costs on intermediaries and made transactions more difficult, but they could not reverse what had already occurred. Diplomatic pressure achieved little. Maduro's government ignored resolutions, court rulings, and condemnations. Power requires accountability mechanisms. When those mechanisms are absent, declarations have no force. The gold was Venezuela's patrimony, accumulated over decades, intended as a buffer for the nation. It was taken by individuals with access to state power and converted into personal security and political payments. The legal term is embezzlement on a national scale. The practical term is theft. The human cost is measured in malnutrition statistics, migration data, and mortality rates. By 2020, the vaults were nearly empty. The insurance policy had been cashed out. What remained barely qualified as reserves. The palace still stood. Maduro still governed. And millions of Venezuelans, scattered across continents or struggling at home, paid the price. The gold could not be recovered. The damage was done. But the palace still stands. Lights still burn. And Maduro still governs. The question becomes, what does it mean to rule from a palace built on theft? January 2026. Miraflores Palace at night. Generators hum in the basement. Guards patrol the grounds in shifts. Inside, meetings continue. Lights burn in the offices and reception rooms. The building functions as it has for decades. Presidential residence, command center, symbol of state power. A kilometer away, reality is different. Gasoline lines stretch for blocks. Drivers wait hours, sometimes days, for fuel in a country built on oil. The minimum wage, when it arrives on time, purchases perhaps a kilogram of rice per month. Supermarkets stock imported goods priced in dollars, accessible only to those with hard currency. The majority of the population cannot afford them. The contrast is not accidental. It is the operating principle. The palace survives. The nation does not. Maduro's government no longer governs in any traditional sense. It controls. Security forces number in the tens of thousands. The Presidential Guard, the Bolivarian National Intelligence Service, military units whose loyalty has been purchased and maintained through selective payments. These forces do not operate on bolivars, the national currency that hyperinflation rendered worthless years ago. They are paid in dollars. They receive imported food, equipment, fuel. Loyalty is transactional, and the transactions continue. International isolation is near total. The United States does not recognize Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate president. The European Union maintains sanctions. Most Latin American governments have withdrawn recognition. Maduro holds no diplomatic legitimacy outside a small circle of allied regimes. But legitimacy and power are not the same thing. He controls Miraflores. He controls the security apparatus. He controls the mechanisms of coercion. That is sufficient. The national economy has collapsed into a strange hybrid. Hyperinflation, which peaked at rates measured in millions of percent annually in 2018 and 2019, has stabilized only because the bolivar has been abandoned. Venezuela now operates on de facto dollarization. Transactions occur in US dollars, Colombian pesos, or other foreign currencies. The official currency exists primarily for government salaries, which buy almost nothing. By recent surveys, poverty rates exceed 90% of the population. Access to basic services, water, electricity, healthcare, has become inconsistent or non-existent for large portions of the country. The electrical grid fails regularly. Blackouts lasting hours or days are routine in most regions. The infrastructure, underinvested for 2 decades, cannot meet even reduced demand. Water systems have deteriorated. In some cities, running water reaches homes only a few hours per week. Residents collect rainwater or purchase from trucks at prices many cannot afford. Oil production, the foundation of everything, has collapsed. In 1998, before Chavez, Venezuela produced approximately 3 million barrels per day. By 2024, production has fallen to around 700,000 barrels per day, according to analyst estimates and OPEC data. PDVSA, gutted by mismanagement and corruption, cannot maintain fields or invest in new extraction. Equipment breaks down. Skilled workers have fled the country. What little oil Venezuela produces goes to service debts to China and Russia, or is sold at discounts for immediate cash. So how does the palace survive without oil revenue or gold reserves? Through extraction and criminal enterprise. The Venezuelan diaspora, estimated at over 7 million people, sends remittances home to families. The regime taxes these transfers. Formal and informal mechanisms siphon a percentage from money moving into the country. Families desperate to support relatives have no choice but to pay. Illegal gold mining in the Arco Minero del Orinoco, a vast region in southern Venezuela, generates revenue outside formal channels. Armed groups, some linked to the military, control mining operations. The gold extracted is not recorded in official statistics. It moves through black markets and is sold abroad. Proceeds flow to those who control the sites. Reports by organizations like Insight Crime and the International Crisis Group document the scale and violence of these operations. Drug trafficking has become a state function in all but name. Venezuelan territory, particularly near the Colombian border, serves as a transit route for cocaine moving from Colombian production areas to Caribbean and Central American markets. High-ranking military officers have been implicated in facilitating these shipments. The U.S. Department of Justice indicted senior Venezuelan officials, including Maduro himself, on narco-terrorism charges in 2020. Whether or not those charges will ever be prosecuted, the documented ties between Venezuelan state actors and trafficking networks are extensive. China and Russia provide credit lines, not as aid, but as bets on future resource access. Venezuela promises oil concessions, mining rights, and strategic cooperation in exchange for cash and goods now. These are not partnerships among equals. They are predatory arrangements. Venezuela mortgages its future for regime survival in the present. The palace, in this context, is not a government. It is an extraction mechanism. It does not provide services. It does not invest in the nation. It maintains itself by siphoning value from whatever sources remain: remittances, illegal mining, drug routes, foreign loans backed by assets that may never be recovered. Maduro does not rule. He controls. Control does not require popular support. It requires coercion and selective patronage. As long as security forces remain paid, as long as key military officers profit, as long as the apparatus of repression functions, the palace holds. The palace endures. But it endures as a monument to extraction, not governance. The question remains, can power built on theft outlast the wealth that was stolen? And what does history remember? The palace stands, gold-trimmed doors, marble floors polished by staff whose salaries arrive when others go unpaid, guards in formation beneath colonial archways, lights burning while neighborhoods sit in darkness. Miraflores endures, not through service, through extraction. 372 metric tons in 2011, roughly 50 tons in 2023. The rest bought time, not for Venezuela, for the regime. Who paid for the palace? The Venezuelan people paid, through stolen reserves accumulated over generations, through national patrimony converted into private security, through an insurance policy meant to protect the nation during crisis, spent instead to insulate those in power from the crisis they created. Future generations were robbed of resources that could have rebuilt an economy, stabilized a currency, or funded recovery. The cost was borne by millions who had no say in the decision and no share in the proceeds. Where did the gold go? Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, offshore accounts in jurisdictions designed for opacity, payments to military officers in dollars and euros, bonuses for intelligence operatives, imported goods for security forces, commissions to intermediaries who arranged flights and refinery access. Some bars can be traced through serial numbers and shipping manifests. Others vanished into the global gold market, resmelted and restamped, origin obscured by design. Precision is impossible. The system was built to prevent it, but the direction is clear. The gold moved from national vaults to private control. The palace survives, but what does survival mean? Some grand structures endure by transforming. They open their doors. They become museums, cultural sites, places that serve a public purpose. They adapt when the wealth that built them runs out. Preservation requires humility, the willingness to change function while protecting essence, to let strangers walk your halls if that is the price of continuity. Miraflores followed a different path. It closed its doors. It fortified its walls. It extracted from the nation to preserve itself. The palace does not serve Venezuela. Venezuela serves the palace. The relationship inverted. What was meant to be the seat of government became a mechanism for predation. History will not remember Maduro for revolutionary promises or Bolivarian ideology. It will remember humanitarian catastrophe, migration on a continental scale, poverty rates approaching totality, hospitals without medicine, children dying from preventable diseases, and gold, 322 metric tons converted into regime survival while the nation starved. The arithmetic is final and unforgiving. Of 322 tons of gold at an average of $1,800 per troy ounce equals approximately $18.6 of billion. That figure is not abstract. It represents purchasing power, medicine for every hospital for years, food imports to stabilize prices and prevent malnutrition, fuel for the electrical grid, investment in water systems, debt restructuring to restore international credit, a managed currency stabilization, time and resources to attempt genuine reform. Or it buys loyalty from men with guns. Maduro chose. He spent the gold on ensuring that generals remained paid, security forces stayed equipped, and the apparatus of coercion continued to function. The choice was calculated. From the perspective of regime preservation, it was rational. Feeding the hungry does not prevent a coup. Paying soldiers does. The palace survives because those with the capacity to remove Maduro have been given reasons not to. The moral weight is unavoidable. This was not crisis management. It was theft on a national scale. The reserves belonged to Venezuela. They were taken by individuals with access to state power and spent on private and political objectives. The justification, emergency liquidity, does not survive scrutiny. Emergencies do not last a decade. Liquidity does not flow to offshore accounts. When Maduro eventually falls, and all regimes do, what remains? A palace associated with extraction and suffering. Vaults stripped nearly bare. A nation that must rebuild from ruins with resources that were stolen. The gold cannot be recovered. The damage cannot be undone. Venezuela will spend generations recovering from choices made in these years. The palace that was meant to symbolize national strength became a symbol of predation. The vaults designed to protect Venezuela's future were emptied to protect one man's present. The dream of Bolivarian socialism, whatever its original intentions, ended in gold bars loaded onto private jets while children went hungry. Beauty without accountability devours. Power without legitimacy corrodes. Grand buildings can survive their creators, but they carry the weight of how they were maintained. Miraflores will stand long after Maduro is gone, and it will stand as a warning. The palace survived, but it survived by consuming the nation it was supposed to serve. The gold that was meant to protect Venezuela in crisis was spent to protect those who caused the crisis. The people paid the price. History will record who made the choice. If you want to understand how nations fall, study the ledgers. If you want to understand who pays, follow the gold. And if you're interested in more investigations into the hidden costs of power, the palace is built on extraction, and the price paid by those who have no choice, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these detailed investigations possible. Tell me in the comments which palace or power structure should be examined next. These stories matter because they reveal what lies beneath grandeur. Thank you for watching.